AP Environmental Science with Miss Hoskins, feeding the world. How did we get to our current level of energy and the use of food production? In the 20th century, the agriculture system was dramatically transformed by a system of small farms and relied mainly on human labor with relatively low fossil fuel inputs and a system of large industrial operations. It had fewer people, but much more machinery. So, this shift in farming methods, known as what we call the Green Revolution, involved new management techniques and machinery mechanisms, as well as the triad of fertilization, irrigation, and improved crop varieties. So, these changes increased food production dramatically, and farmers were able to feed much more people. So the Green Revolution began in particularly like 1914 till about 2009 is the estimated time period for that certain scientists call the Green Revolution. There's one scientist who won a Nobel Prize for his contribution to increasing the world food supply. So through this intensive breeding of agriculture and research, developed strands of wheat were disease resistant and they basically produced higher yields. And so they also used fertilizer to irrigate and improve yields. By 1940, researchers had brought more of these techniques to nations like Mexico and the Philippines. And so by the 1970s, many countries were doing this. So before we go further, there's two terms that I want you to understand: mechanization and the economies of scale. So mechanization farming involves many kinds of work. Fields must be plowed, planted, irrigated, weeded, protected from pests, harvest, and basically prepared for the next season. So even after harvesting crops, things die and then they need to be sorted and cleaned and basically prepared for the market. There's many different types of crops. They require a bunch of different things. So machines, they do not necessarily do all the work for us, but they do work better with humans and animals. So, but is it an economic advantage to have humans replaced by machinery or animals replaced by machinery? Particularly if fossil fuels are abundant, then fuel prices are relatively low and, labor can be more expensive than the cost of using machines. But since this has all been put into play, large farms producing like staple crops like bean and corn, they have generally become more profitable than smaller farms. So size matters because economics of scale or the economies of scale, which means that the average cost of production can fall as an output as the production increases. So, for example, if a new let's just say we have a new harvester, like a machine that harvests crops that separates grain and seed, has a transport cost of like $150,000 to $400,000. It's a large amount of money up front, but it can be a good investment for the farm because the machine can justify the profits that it will save the farmer. Speaking of machines, it also means that like single crop farms can be generally more efficient than farms that grow many different kinds of things. Because the machines are crop planted and then they're picked up, they're real specialized. It can be expensive equipment to just do one type of crop. So if you grow like all corn, this can be more cost effective. So one type of machine that has been developed that has really led this agricultural revolution is irrigation. An irrigation system like the one shown in the picture here can increase crop growth or even increase crop yield substantially. Irrigation's basically transformed farming. In California, California is the major producer of fruits and vegetables, and irrigation allows it to be the most productive land, and now it's considered an extremely productive land. So one estimate suggests that 16% of the world's agricultural land is irrigated, and that produces 40% of the world's food. So while irrigation has lots of benefits, including more effective use of water in some places where water can be scarce, it also has a number of negative consequences. It basically depletes groundwater, draws into aquifers, and that can actually cause like saltwater intrusion into freshwater wells. In addition to the aquifers, it can also contribute to soil degradation through waterlogging and salinization. So waterlogging is a form of soil degradation that occurs when soil remains underwater for like a prolonged period of time. Basically impairs root systems because they can't get any oxygen. So salinization occurs when a small amount of salts in the irrigation water system become highly concentrated and they come on top of the soil surface, and that usually happens through the process of evaporation. These salts eventually reach toxic levels and they basically impede or stop plant growth. Another part to this green revolution was fertilizers. So agriculture removes organic matter and nutrients from the soil. And if these materials are not replenished, then everything will get depleted real quickly, nothing will grow. Industrial agriculture, because it keeps soil at a constant production, requires a large amount of fertilizer to replace all of this lost organic matter and nutrients. Fertilizers contain essential nutrients for plants, primarily nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and they foster plant growth with one or more of these nutrients that the soil can be lacking. There are two types of fertilizers in the agricultural world. We call those organic or synthetic. So as the name suggests, organic fertilizers are composed of organic matter from plants and animals, and they're typically made up of animal manure and they've been allowed to decompose. So traditional farming is often where you would spread the manure along your crop, and that would, cause the crops to have the crops to have more nutrients, and so you could reharvest them. So synthetic fertilizers or inorganic fertilizers, we produce those commercially in factories. So normally, with the use of fossil fuels to contribute to all of this, nitrogen fertilizers are often produced by the combustion of natural gas, which allows the nitrogen from the atmosphere to be fixed and captured into fertilizer. All right, fertilizers produced in this way are highly concentrated and they're widespread, and we use them increasingly more and more across crops. And since the Green Revolution began, synthetic fertilizers have had many advantages over organic fertilizers. I mean, they're basically designed for easy application. Their nutrient content can be targeted, specifically for what the crop needs. And then the plants can easily absorb them, even in the poorest soils. But still, those fertilizers, enter our waterways through runoff, causing a lot of more other problems. But both the machinery of agriculture and the use of these synthetic fertilizers encourage large plantings of a single crop species. And that actually has a term. It's called monocropping. Monocropping is a dominant agricultural practice in the United States, where like wheat or cotton are frequently grown as monocrops. You can have 1,000 acres or more. So monocropping has greatly improved practices and productivity, and this technique allows large expanses of land to be planted and harvested and all at the same time. With the use of these large machineries, we can do this cost effectively. And if fertilizers or pesticide treatments are required, those treatments can be applied uniformly over the large area because, they only require the one thing. So, but despite all these benefits, increased efficiency and all that productivity, monocropping can lead to an environmental degradation. First, soil erosion can become a problem because the fields that are monocropped rely on planting and harvesting to be done all at one time. So the soil is exposed all at the same time. All right. Not only that, but monocropping also makes crops more vulnerable to pests. So pesticides are substances that are either natural or synthetic that basically kill or control organisms considered to be pests, things that eat the plants. The use of these pesticides has become routine and widespread. In the United States, over 227 million kilograms or 500 million pounds of pesticides are applied to food crops and cotton and like fruit trees all the time. And the United States accounts for more than 1/3 of all the worldwide pesticide use. Insecticides target species of insects and other invertebrates that consume crops. And herbicides target plants and species that compete with crops. Like some pesticides are broad spectrum pesticides, meaning that they kill many different types of pests. And then some of them are selective pesticides, which means they target a narrower group of organisms. So whether we're dealing with a broad spectrum pesticide, a selective pesticide, or a persistent pesticide, the application process it is the same. The application of all of this is a rapid and relatively easy response to any infestation of any crop. In many cases, a single application of this stuff can significantly reduce the pest population or take it off entirely. But preventing crop damage, pesticides allow greater yield on that particular lot of land. And so they basically reduce the area that can be undisturbed, making it more profitable. But the application of pesticides, like many other industrial practices, prevents us from doing this environmentally friendly. So let me give you an example. Pesticides are often injure or kill their targeted species. And some pesticides, such as the persistent pesticide DDT, I'm going to try to pronounce this for you, dichlorophenyl triethylethane, we call that DDT, as well as a persistent pesticide. And it means it remains in the environment for a very long time. In 1972, DDT was banned from the United States, in part because it was found to accumulate in the fatty tissue of animals, like eagles and pelicans, and it basically increased concentration over time. And so when animals like laid eggs, they had like thin-shelled walls in their egg, and they cracked and they couldn't be incubated. And so we learned all of this, that this pesticide basically killed and harmed a lot of these populations, mostly of birds, actually. Other pesticides and herbicides like Roundup are what we call non-persistent pesticides, meaning that they lack the ability to break down relatively rapidly, but they will within a few weeks or months. But it still takes a long time. But because they've been applied more often, they're basically out there in the environment hanging out. So when you have something out there in the environment that's hanging out, and if you're a pest, what do? Well, like any good creature of God, you become pesticide resistant. You build up an immunity to it. So surviving individuals from this population when we sprayed all this stuff are considered to be pesticide resistant. And if the pesticide is successful at reducing the pest population, then the next generation is going to have what? A resistance to that pesticide. And so time goes on, more of them multiply, and they basically increase and make a huge population of pesticide-resistant creatures. And this cycle of pest resistance is illustrated in what we call a pesticide treadmill. I can't believe this actually exists, but this is also another example of a positive feedback system.